Welcome everyone to LR lesson number 8. Today we will be taking another look at assumptions due to recent sort of instructional things that I've encountered these days. And we'll be drawing questions from PT 58, sections 1 and section 4. They're probably numbered differently on Law Hub. I think section 2 and 3 are always LR on Law Hub, so it's probably section 2 and section 3 respectively for you guys. Apologies in advance for the small font on the slide. I made some formatting choices and there wasn't really a good compromise between font size and clarity. So yeah, sorry, squint a little bit or lean closer to your monitors, zoom in, whatever you need to do. It's a little bit small. So I want to start by saying that yes, I have addressed assumptions before, but for the October and November 2023 exams, a number of my students wanted a more efficient overview of various assumption types. They didn't need like in-depth lessons on each one, but they just wanted to have an overall picture of how I saw the assumption landscape so that they could kind of learn when to shift gears or focus on one way versus another to categorize assumptions, that sort of thing. And so in response, what I came up with is four classifications of assumptions. The first category is the classic assumption pattern, and I've referred to this as P versus C in older content. And this refers to situations where the premise contains idea P, and the conclusion jumps to distinct idea C, and the assumption is merely something that properly links idea P to idea C. That's all that it is. It's the easiest one. I know most of you guys, if not all of you, are probably doing this correctly anyway. The next is a slight variation on this classic pattern, which, due to lack of creative juices, I just called it classic plus. So what is classic plus? This is when both the premise and the conclusion, they do both explicitly address concept P. So the conclusion isn't totally hanging out on its own, talking about something weird and alien. It does link itself back to concept P. However, the conclusion on top of that adds concept C and it kind of comes out of nowhere. In these scenarios, the assumption is that C is in fact relevant or true. And that brings us to the third category, which I consider to be the most important one of today's lesson, which is what I refer to as situations that call for you to look at the general form of the assumption. Um, so the scenario, without getting into too much depth up front here, that you use this for is when premises consist of reasonable sounding, very often scientific stuff that's hard to distill into a useful P concept. Similarly, more problematically, the conclusion also consists of reasonable sounding, usually scientific stuff that really sounds totally acceptable, and that is a problem. So those of you who have been seeing my older content, you know that in LR I generally espouse an attitude of hostility. That means that even if the exam doesn't explicitly tell you that an argument is flawed, even if it's a assumption question or strengthen or weaken, which you have probably been taught by other people that those aren't explicitly wrong. To me, I encourage you to see those as explicitly wrong. Because what is an assumption, right? An assumption is something that the arguer has failed to include. They have left it out. It's something that they require to make their argument work. It's an essential piece of information that they just forgot or didn't realize they needed to give you. And it's our job to find what that is. To me, that's a deficiency. If you're running around making arguments that are full of assumptive holes, you're a terrible arguer. And so that's the attitude that I would encourage you to have. However, the situation that I described, which does happen frequently on harder questions, it's just hard to see how it sounds good. It doesn't sound like there's a problem with it. You can't instinctively find a gap, and that's an issue. But how do we get around this issue? Well, we use the general form of the assumption, which sounds something like the following. The assumption in these cases is that the premises cover the entire discussion, that there's nothing left undiscussed that affects the validity of the conclusion. So to put it more simply, in the general form of the assumption in these situations, the arguer is simply assuming that they have told the entire story with their premises. That's it. End of the discussion. Um, so yeah, that there's so anything that highlights that no, maybe that isn't the end of the discussion would be a good weakener or a description of the flaw, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what the assumption is. The assumption is that um, the arguer believes that in including the premises that they have, they've told the whole story. There's nothing really else to talk about. That brings us now to the fourth and final, and in my opinion, one of the less important categories of, or yeah, perhaps the most least important of the four here, but that's the P versus P plus pattern. In this situation, premise one contains idea P, premise two contains idea P plus. The conclusion is just kind of like it's hard to pin it down into a useful concept C. You can, but it's not really going to be that useful for you. The assumption in these scenarios is most helpfully or is most often um, that P and P plus have the sort of relationship that is alleged by the conclusion. Note that you could conceivably use um, any of these four patterns to assess necessary assumption stimuli as well. But necessary assumption stimuli are their own little beast, their own separate ordeal. This particular video that I'm doing now is done mostly with standard old sufficient assumptions or strength and weaken flaw questions in mind. And finally, moving forward from here on this particular video, I am not going to go too deeply in depth into all the answer choices. And I just realized that that's a little bit redundant, but too lazy to edit. So yeah, not too deeply in depth into all the answer choices as I usually have done in these LR lessons. And that's because my goal today is to kind of keep runtime low and also maintain focus on the classifications themselves rather than the answers. So now let's go over the four patterns with some specific examples from the exam, starting with the easiest one, the classic P versus C situation. So for this one, take a look at PT 58, section 4, again, try section 3 for you guys. Question number 5, which is a flaw question. So for this one, if you read the premises, they essentially boil down to the idea that the company is going to hire people who have worked for the top 1% firms in the industry. The conclusion that this person draws is that therefore the company is going to end up hiring the very best people based on the hiring practice outlined in red. The assumption here is simply that um, P equals C, or more accurately, anybody who is in group P that they end up hiring is also going to happen to be, uh, you know, the type of person that's in group C, the very best. So to kind of break it down a little bit more specifically, the arguer assumes that by restricting themselves to picking only people from pool P, they are guaranteed to get a C out of that process. This means that they are assuming that everyone in pool P is also a C, that there's no way for them to be picking only from pool P and end up with something that's not a C. So answer choice A here correctly highlights this assumption, albeit with mildly trollish wording. The use of the word only here is correct in the answer choice, but it could easily cause you to do a double take this early in the section just to make sure. At least that's how it was for me. It didn't make this question particularly hard, but honestly, if it were me and I wanted to be clear about it, I would have worded it the way that I did, that everyone who's in a 1% firm, everyone who's from a 1% firm is among the very best. That would be what they're assuming, but they didn't, of course, put it exactly that way. All right, and you guys in most of my LR lessons are used to me going through all five of the answer choices and addressing all of them. I'm not going to do that here just to kind of maintain focus on. Uh, Now moving into the classic plus pattern. For this one, I'm going to be looking at the same exam, PT58, but I'll be looking back to section 1, question number 3, which is a strengthener. And we are supposed to strengthen the letter writer's claim regarding the editorial. So, as it turns out, since the letter writer is trying to deny the editorial, we are effectively strengthening the letter writer and in so doing, in turn, weakening the editorial. That's kind of how to look at it here. The editorial's premise is that the planning department spent 100K in 2001, and now, whenever now happens to be, we don't know exactly which year it is, and has now spent over 500K in the past year. So that's the premise. The editorial's conclusion is that the planning department spent 5 times more now than they did in 2001, which is, again, exactly what was proved by the numbers in the premise, while also performing the same duties. Part of the challenge for this particular stimulus is that a lot of folks um, kind of get hung up on the fact that both the premise and the conclusion share the red part, and then you kind of forget, and then you can't really find out what the difference is between the premise and the conclusion. So you kind of lose sight of the blue part here, which is that the editorial, not the letter writer, but the editorial accuses the planning department of having that 5x increase in spending, all while performing the same duties that they did in 2001. So yeah, the blue part is the new part in the conclusion. That's the C. So the assumption here, like I said on the first slide, is going to take the form of the arguer is assuming that C, concept C, the fact that the planning department allegedly has the same duties now as it did back in 2001. The arguer is assuming that that is in fact the case, whereas they have failed to establish that in any of the premises. So again, this is quite similar to P versus C. It's just that there's nothing really to attach C to. C is just kind of hanging out there on its own. So the assumption takes a slightly different form than the P versus C scenario. So the editorial's 5x spending part, like I've been saying, is accounted for in the premises, but the additional claim that this 5x spending occurred while the planning department was also still performing the same duties, that came out of nowhere. So this means now that the editorial assumes that the planning department's duties remained the same, in fact remained the same between 2001 and now. Again, we don't know when now is, but it's just not 2001, right? Now, the letter writer, and the letter writer is the person that the question stem asks us to support. The letter writer says that the editorial's claims above are unjustified. So therefore, we'll be looking for an answer choice that erodes the validity of the editorial's position, which would be anything that suggests that the planning department's duties did in fact change after 2001, and E fits the bill pretty much exactly. Pushing right along into the general form of the assumption now. Um, let's start with this. What exactly is the general form of the assumption? In LR, I would say that every single arguer is fundamentally assuming, no matter what their argument is, that their premises are somehow good enough to support their conclusion. Obviously, what I have highlighted in orange and yellow above, it's true, yes, but it's also so generic as to be pretty unhelpful. And ironically, it is the least helpful on the easiest LR questions, which are going to be the classic or classic plus, broadly speaking. And as you've seen on those, it's much smarter to hunt directly for the P and C concepts and kind of form a prephrase based on those, rather than starting at this general form and then making it more specific as you go along. That's neither necessary nor efficient. However, this is where the general form shines and why I've included it today. The general form does help on arguments that don't have an obvious gap assumption flaw or are not easily divisible into the P versus C kind of pattern. In particular, reasonable sounding scientific or medical stimuli are susceptible to a general form analysis. So, in that vein, let's start with a sciencey one right here. That's PT 58, section 1, question number 5, which is a weekend question. So this is our doctor saying stuff here. Um, and the premise starts with, well, I mean, there are several elements to the premise. Let's just go over both of them. We hear that alternative medicines are safe and they might even actually help people. I would say that those are two distinct ideas within the premises. That so we have these two pieces of data that alternative medicines are safe and they possibly can help people. The conclusion is that therefore alternative medicines should be allowed to be prescribed. Apologies for kind of the clunky passive voice here, but I decided to do that just to keep the writing a little bit more consistent and have it line up. But yeah, that's what the conclusion is, that alternative medicines should be allowed to be prescribed. Now, using the general form of the assumption, our arguer is assuming that P1 and P2 are enough to end the discussion. There's nothing else out there that maybe perhaps stands between the conclusion C and the premises P1 and P2. That's what's going on here. So while this is also arguably a classic plus scenario, because you can see that C doesn't really talk about um, uh, P1 and P2 directly, and it just kind of attaches concept C, the prescription recommendation, out of nowhere. Um, I feel the purple assumption text in between. It's worth learning as a pattern distinct from the standard classic plus situation, particularly for science stimuli, because I just feel like me saying that has helped more people than not when it comes to untangling these reasonable sounding science stimuli. So to weaken this argument, I'm just going to look for anything that might in fact stand between the conclusion and the premises offered. And A sounds pretty good. It raises an issue the arguer overlooked, that practitioners and patients could be incentivized to ignore better treatments. And that seems like a reason not to just rubber stamp the approval of prescribing alternative medicines. So again, the conclusion is that we should just be okay with these alternative medicines being prescribed, and the only basis for that is that they're safe and that they might even help people. Well, then the assumption is that there's nothing else to discussion. There's nothing else that they've talked about, or that they haven't talked about, excuse me, that may make us reconsider that conclusion C, whereas answer choice A definitely gets us to reconsider that. So yeah. But just for more evidence on this, I'm going to do a second question for the general form. PT 58, section 1, so same exam, same section. But we will be looking at question number 11 now for very much the same thing that we just saw for question number 5. This one's a flaw question, though. let's start with the premises, which are kind of confusing in their own right. The very first premise that we get is that a recent study shows some sort of correlation between damage to chromosome 6, which moving forward I will just truncate to the word damage, and the disease adult schizophrenia, which moving forward I will just truncate to the word disease. Problematically, though, there are people who have damage but no disease, and even worse, there are people who lack damage but still got the disease anyways. So this is kind of weird. And the conclusion is, yeah, this is kind of weird. There's no causal connection between damage and disease, and honestly, that's one of the first things that I would think of when it comes to this sort of collection of evidence slash premises is that, yeah, I mean, maybe we have no idea what the relationship actually is. And therein kind of lies the key here. But before getting into it more deeply, let's just throw up the general form of the assumption that you should use here. The general form of the assumption in this case is that there's nothing else to discuss regarding the potential causal connection between damage and disease. So remember, think back. One of my out loud musings was that based on this set of premises, I would agree that we don't really know anything about um, the relationship, or at least we don't know as much as we'd like about the relationship between damage and the disease. Um, and so I would be very, very on board in sort of a real world sense with denying that there is a causal conclusion based on what we've seen because there's some sort of disconnect, right? But really, if you listen closely to what I said, there is the seeds of what's wrong with this argument in there. Um, all we really know is that we don't know what's going on between these two. We don't actually know that there isn't a causal relationship. Um, but of course, if our arguer has structured their argument as they have, they are in fact assuming that somehow we know enough based on the premises given to conclude that in fact there is no causal relationship. Whereas in reality, the only safe conclusion to make is that we just don't know, that we just don't know enough. And of course, that's reflected in the general form of the assumption, which basically plays it safe by saying, hey, the arguer is just assuming that there's nothing else left to discuss about the potential causal connection. We're not saying that there is, but we also don't know that there isn't. So I want to note at this point that even though I have come up with a sort of quote unquote pre-phrase that's in purple here, I have absolutely zero clue, what that other stuff, nothing else might be, right? I don't know, I don't have the scientific knowledge or just general creativity, really, I guess, to predict what that thing that they've failed to discuss actually should be. I just know that there's something else out there and that I should be able to recognize it when I see it. I am purely relying on the fact that because the argument actually sounds pretty good to my, at least in terms of science, layperson ears, I should just fall back on using the general form of the assumption to try to figure out where this argument leaves a gap for me to exploit. And I admit, if you really wanted to, you could identify all three premises, P1, P2, P3, and C, and attempt doing it that way, but like, why, man? Why do it that way? Just skip right to the general form of the assumption in these scenarios. I find that that's what tends to work out the best. And in this lens, A sounds pretty good. Just like the last question, just like question number 5. It raises an issue the arguer overlooked, which is that perhaps damage type matters, not just generic damage. And that seems like a reason not to just agree that the discussion is over. So again, starting with the general form of the assumption, which is that the arguer is simply assuming that they've told the complete story with the premises and that there's nothing else to discuss. When we're dealing with a weakener or a flaw, like this question, answer like A and answer like A is what we're looking for exactly. It is something that says like, hey, actually there is something else you didn't mention that is probably worth considering. Your conclusion is not safe from the implications of this new piece of information. In actuality, when I was doing this question, I didn't eliminate A on first pass, but I didn't pick it either. I wasn't really comfortable picking it because I was like, damn, it's type. Like I don't know if that's relevant or not. It didn't fit in any of my predictions because, like I said, I didn't really have a specific prediction. I just had the purple concept. That's all that I had in my head, and so I knew it could have been right, but I didn't like it that much. So I just kind of, um, pushed into the other answer choices. But fortunately, it turned out that B through E were fairly simple to eliminate, which made me much more comfortable looping back and ultimately choosing A. So again, this has to be sort of like a combined arms exercise if we're going to sort of borrow a military term for this. It's not just that you should just do the general form of the assumption. This is another tool that you should use in concert with the other tools that you have. One of the most effective ones being process of elimination. So yeah. This now brings us into our final category, which is P versus P plus. And I have addressed this pattern very directly in another video, which I will try to remember to link you guys to in the upper right corner. I happen to be out of time to record this particular video, and I don't think it's really important enough to be sitting on this video until my next opportunity. I'll have to work on it, which is who knows when. So yeah, just in the interest of getting this video out and being a little bit lazy, I don't have time to actually hunt for a specific example of this. I could probably find one, but eh. I'll just give you an alternative, which is what I'll discuss in a second here. But before getting into it, the most important thing is that honestly, P versus P plus can be seen as just a very slight deviance from the general form of the assumption. They very much start in the same place. It's just that P versus P plus scenarios give us a little extra upper hand, a little hint, a little push to closer towards the right answer. Um, so in terms of, while I didn't have time to actually find a question that was a very good example of this. Um, in a response to a comment that someone left on the aforementioned video that I already made on this subject, I offered what I consider to be a decent theoretical example of when P versus P plus actually works pretty well, and I will reproduce that example here. So even though I don't have a question, I do have a theoretical or hypothetical question, kind of I think does a pretty good job. So this is what the argument would look like. We'll start with premise one, which is concept P. It's just going to say generically, thing A happened, which has a certain effect on the status quo. The second premise, which contains P plus, tells us that thing B also happened, which has the opposite effect that A did on the status quo. So thing A happened, it has one effect on the status quo. Thing B also happened, which has the opposite effect on the status quo. Pretty simple. And finally, we get a conclusion that offers us distinct idea C, which is that therefore there's no net change to the status quo. While it is technically possible, again, to do a more classic or classic plus approach to this, in my experience, I and my students perform consistently better on these types of questions. When we focus on P versus P plus, since C is so, I don't even know how to put it, generic, incomplete. Yeah, I don't even know what to call it here. But it's not that helpful to me. It's just not that helpful in terms of forming a prephrase. The assumption in this case, which you should think sounds suspiciously identical to the general form of the assumption, is that P and P plus are somehow enough to justify C. So that is quite literally just replacing some of the terms in the general form of the assumption with P, P plus, and C. That's all that this is. However, this level of general form of the assumption isn't where I stop when I smell this P versus P plus scenario. So if just saying P, which is thing A in its effect, and P plus thing B in its effect, if just saying those two things is enough to justify C that there has been, in fact, no net change, that in turn means that the author assumes that P and P plus occurred in equal measure, canceling each other out perfectly. Note that the underlined version of the assumption is just really a more specific version of the non-underlined version, but to its credit, the underlined version sounds a lot more like a potential answer choice to me. That's just the way that I see it. So again, it's technically really, if you want to get down to it, just a slight variant of the general form of the assumption. But you can, in this particular case, the hypothetical that I offered, there was a way to pit the ideas of P and P plus against each other in a way that is probably closer to an answer choice. And that finally, folks, brings us to the takeaway slide. My four general classification of assumptions are as follows. We start with the classic, which is the very bog standard P versus C pattern. You all know how to do that already. The next one is the classic plus, which is just a slight variation of classic. The conclusion does have the idea P in it from the premises, but it also adds C out of nowhere, which changes the way that we do our assumption a little bit. And when we get to our third category here, which I again consider to be the most useful and important one of all the ones that I discussed here, if the whole argument actually sounds quite good and thereby difficult to challenge, then by default, just simply define the assumption as the arguer thinks their premises complete the discussion. There's nothing else left to discuss that potentially separates their premises from reaching their conclusion. But everything before the semicolon honestly is enough. The arguer just thinks their premise is complete the discussion. That's it. Nothing else to say. And finally, the fourth category is P versus P plus. Arguably, again, like I just got finished talking about, this is just general form plus. But as you already kind of know if you've seen my content, I generally detest overly technical discussions like that. And it is useful enough to see it as P versus P plus in enough situations where that, yeah, I mean, I feel like it's worth teaching separately. The general form, as I said, is what I think most people can benefit from using on those, man, I can't actually tell what's wrong with this sort of stimuli. Those are the hardest questions, and those are the ones you guys need to start getting right in order to move from that mid 160s up to the 170 plus zone. So yeah, that's today. As always, thanks for being here. If you have any questions, leave a comment, or as you guys seem more comfortable doing, email me. And my name is James at the email address here on the screen. If you have any further questions or any clarifications or tutoring inquiries, all that should go to this email. So yeah, have a good one, and I will see you guys in the next one.